What happened 40 years ago is that as we were shifting from being a culture rooted in tradition to a culture that allowed the media to tell us how to live our lives, a media-oriented culture, the media uplifted a group of people and said to the American public, if you want the real skinny on how to raise children, you'd better listen to these people. They really know what they're talking about. Look, they have capital letters after their names. And of course, the media was referring to and giving a platform to people like me, people in the mental health profession, psychologists, clinical social workers, family therapists, family counselors, and so on. And with the able assistance of the media, we mental health professionals, we were able to convince the American public, you, of something completely and utterly absurd, and that is that, and I'll just use a hypothetical case in both instances, that a person, say 35 years old with a PhD in psychology, and this person's been married for 5 years and has one child age 3, knows more about children and how to raise them properly than does a 78-year-old woman with a 5th grade education who's raised 10, all of whom are fine, upstanding members of the community. An entirely absurd proposition. And yet, with the assistance of the media, we were able to convince you of this. And so, you, and I'm referring to American parents, began listening to us when it came to the rearing of children. And when we realized that we had your ear, we went about demonizing traditional parenting. We went about demonizing the traditional family, the traditional marriage. We did this, I believe, in order to differentiate ourselves, number one, but also in order to addict you in a somewhat literal, but primarily figurative sense of the term, to the advice that we were dispensing. We created a demonic myth that caused an entire generation of American parents who bought into this myth to resolve that if there was one thing they were not going to do as adults, it was they weren't going to raise their children the way they themselves were raised. The demonic myth goes something like this. All of us baby boomers, we were raised in pathologically dysfunctional families by pathologically codependent parents who infected us with their codependence and abused us psychologically, if not physically. If you remember the abuse, you were abused. And if you don't remember the abuse, well, then you were certainly abused. And by the way, while there is, no doubt about it, children in previous generations have been abused, it's interesting to note that since we embraced this experiment, that not only has every indicator of positive mental health in American children been sliding precipitously downhill, but also, by all accounts, the rate of child abuse in America across the demographic spectrum has been climbing. Not simply a reporting artifact. A recent study which controlled for reporting variables still found that the rate of child abuse in America has climbed, which is a good indication, folks, of parental stress in America today. And one of the things that I'm going to be proposing to you is that parenting has become such a tremendously stressful, frustrating enterprise in this country simply because you have been listening to the wrong people for 40 years. You have been listening to people like me, which is ironic. Grandma, and grandma is the term that I use to refer generically to parents of previous generations, the traditional, old-fashioned, pre-modern parent. Grandma is defined as being a parent who, in her parenting, was informed by traditional sources. She was informed by her extended family. She was informed by her community, her church community, her neighborhood. She was informed by elders in those communities. And she was informed by Judeo-Christian scripture, our primary book of tradition in Western civilization. She also is defined by the fact that she finished most of her child rearing before 1960, which does not mean all of her children were out of the house by 1960, but simply that her youngest child was a teenager by 1960. Once you have all of your children into their teenage years, your parenting is over, whether you realize it or not. It's all maintenance and repair from that point on. So Grandma, the pre-modern parent, and also by means of clarification, I'm not simply referring to the female parent, but it's just easier to say Grandma than it is to constantly say Grandma and Grandpa. So Grandma, in the raising of her children, she was focused on character issues. She was focused on their citizenship, which she knew to be a matter of their character. And she was using what I refer to as the workshop of her family to instruct her children in character virtues, like the three virtues that I define as the 3 R's of parenting, because to me they seem to have consisted the core of Grandma's teachings: respect for adults in positions of legitimate authority, a willingness to accept responsibility, both in terms of accountability for one's own behavior and tasks assigned by authority figures, and thirdly, a resourceful, hang in there, tough it out, try and try again attitude brought to the challenges of life. Respect, responsibility, and resourcefulness. Grandma was not focused on, for example, seeing to it that her children, developed talent in a musical instrument or got into gifted and talented programs, or the other things that parents today seem to be focused on. She was focused on character, because she knew that a person of strong character is a person who is outfitted for success in life, regardless of whether he plays a musical instrument or not, regardless of what his IQ is, etc., etc. And folks, just on the IQ issue, which I bring to the fore only because I'm speaking to an audience that represents a generation that seems fixated on the idea of getting their children into gifted and talented programs. Let me point out to you, as I point out to most of my audiences, that each and every one of you knows a person with a very high IQ who has made a complete mess of his or her life and a mess of the lives of people around them. And yet, none of you know anyone of good character who has done that. People of good character, they fail at certain things. Make no mistake about it, we all fail at one thing or another in our lives. But people of good character in their failures, they don't mess up their own lives or other people's. They pick themselves up, they dust themselves off, they check out the lessons they have learned through this failure, and they keep on trucking, as we say in the vernacular of today. So I ask you this question: are we really focused on the right issues in parenting today? And I would suggest we are not, because psychologists and other mental health professionals shifted the attention in parenting away from character issues to the issue of psychological development and skill development. Psychologists and other mental health professionals told us that what we ought to be doing is focusing primarily on the development of something they called self-esteem, which in fact they said was increased vis-a-vis the number of skills the child became proficient at. So these are really one and the same thing. Self-esteem, making children feel wonderful about themselves, feel special. I was in a school in Alabama not long ago, and it was about 1.5 years ago, I would imagine, and I walked into it was an elementary school. I walked into the boys' restroom before the talk that I was to deliver there, and when I turned to face the mirror, I could not help but notice a large banner splashed above the mirror which read, and the printing was in large letters, computer-generated, hand-colored, "You are now looking at one of the most special people in the whole wide world." And I thought, how completely disgusting. How absolutely absurd. How ridiculous. And there are some of you out there who are maybe going, John, what are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about the mere fact, the basic fundamental truth, which is that no one is special, no one is wonderful. And you see, Grandma understood that. Grandma understood that every child brings into the world with him human nature. And folks, human nature is not a pretty thing. And Grandma understood this. She understood, I put it this way, that every child comes into the world with his very own Pandora's box. A box filled with a tremendous capacity for narcissistically driven antisocial behavior. Behind every antisocial act is the narcissistic impulse. The narcissistic impulse can be summarized in this fashion. It resides within a person and causes that person to believe that what he wants, he deserves, and the ends justify the means. Narcissists are antisocial people. Narcissists believe that they are special and wonderful. Grandma, she thought her children were special. She did not want them thinking they were special. But we have been wanting children to think that they are special for the last 40 years. Yeah, I thought to myself as I was looking at that banner, how absolutely ridiculous. But this is emblematic of the absurd nature of parenting in America today and the absurd nature of it for the last 40 years. You know, let me ask you this question. In Scripture it says you raise up a child in the way that he will go. Now folks, that's for better or worse. You raise up a child in the way that he will go, for better or worse. Do we want adults thinking that they are special and wonderful? Would any of you be inclined to want to be friends with someone who, 5 minutes after meeting them, it became completely obvious to you, believed he was one of the most special people in the whole wide world? No, folks. A person who is an adult who believes that way about himself or herself is socially repulsive. They're obnoxious. Nobody wants to be friends with them. Now, why would we want children to believe something about themselves that is socially repulsive and obnoxious in an adult? By the way, when I said before that narcissistic people are antisocial and narcissistic people have high self-esteem, a recent study was done, and I'm referring to it in my next book, which is called Raising a Nonviolent Child. It'll be out in September for those of you who are interested. There was a study done in 1996 by a group of people from Case Western Reserve University, a group of psychologists who reviewed all of the literature in self-esteem. One of the things that they did was to administer self-esteem reports or surveys to various populations of people, various groups of people around the country, in occupational groups and demographic groups, etc., etc. The people who scored the highest on these surveys of self-esteem were people incarcerated in maximum security prisons. These people have high self-esteem, folks. They think the rules don't apply to them. They're a cut above the rules. That's why they're in prison. They believe what they want, they deserve. That's why they're in prison. They believe the ends justify the means. That's why they're in prison. They are dangerous people. And folks, let me just take a little tangent here. As we have been telling children they are special and wonderful, the American child has become increasingly dangerous to himself and to other people. Grandma understood. This child comes into the world carrying his very own Pandora's box. Her job is to keep a firm hand on the lid of the box until the child is old enough to keep the lid of the box closed himself. And today, folks, we don't believe in human nature anymore. We don't believe that every child comes into the world carrying this thing called human nature and that it is not a pretty thing. We believe, courtesy of the psychobabble of the last 40 years, in a new age vision of the child. We believe, in effect, that every child is an incarnate being of holy light sent down from heaven to grace us with his or her immaculate presence. Folks, today we have an idealized, romanticized, sentimentalized vision of children. And it's blinding us to the realities of who they really are. And if we are blind to the realities of who they really are, then we are also encumbered in carrying out our responsibilities to them and to our fellow human beings. Human nature is not a pretty thing. And Grandma understood this in part because she was attuned, if not explicitly, then certainly implicitly, to the messages contained in Western civilization's first parenting story, Genesis chapter 3. It's a parenting story. It's all about a parent and his first two children. 750 words in length, give or take, depending on translation. I would encourage each and every one of you this afternoon when you go home, take out the family Bible, flip it open to Genesis chapter 3 and read it. It is a fascinating story. And here it is. It's a snapshot of human nature. It's a snapshot of what every parent will forever have to deal with his or her children. The story goes like this in sum. The only perfect parent there is or ever will be creates two children who disobey his first instruction. They do, as soon as his back is turned, the most outrageous thing they could possibly have done in his house. Right off the bat. And Grandma read this and she understood, you see, as a consequence of this, there was no parenting effort that she, a mere mortal, could make that would guarantee that her children would always be well behaved and would never do anything outrageous. No parenting effort could guarantee that. She could minimize the likelihood of outrageous behavior through her parenting, but she could never guarantee a child who was always well behaved. Her parenting was not, in the final analysis, as powerful as it might have been, more powerful than human nature. Human nature is a powerful thing. As somebody said to me recently, after hearing this talk, they said, John, basically what you meant is, you don't have to teach a child to behave, you have to teach him to stop misbehaving. And isn't that true? Isn't it true? Grandma also understood that for the first 2 years of her child's life, she had to do something that would, by the time this child was 2 years old, produce a raging narcissist. She had to. She had no choice. What she had to do was she had to orbit around her child in a ministry of constant service. Orbiting, doing things for this child. All the while giving him the impression that as his parents, and primarily his mother, is doing, because it's a one-person job, really. Two people are just going to get in each other's way. It's a one-person job. And 99.9% of the time, women are on the front lines of this, giving their infant and young toddler children the impression that as they are doing, so the world revolves around them. And also giving these children the impression that they run the show. You see, you have to understand that an infant and a toddler has no sense of history. He has no sense that anything existed before the moment that he opened his eyes and, from his point of view, created the universe. He has no appreciation for the bigger picture. He does not know that he is helpless. He does not know that he is completely dependent on somebody else for his very survival on a day-to-day basis. Why, from his point of view, he is pulling the strings. He makes a loud noise, and someone appears and says, basically, "How may I serve you, my lord? What may I do for you?" And we figure out what this child wants and we do it. And every single time we reinforce this child's growing perception of himself as the most omnipotent power in the known universe. The rules don't apply to him because obviously he's making the rules. What he wants, he deserves because that's his daily fare. And Grandma knew that by age 2, she had on her hands a thoroughly raging narcissist, a little criminal. Yeah, they're little criminals, aren't they? What would you think of an adult who, every time he was frustrated, threw himself on the floor and began screaming and yelling and hitting people who came close, and every time you told him to do something said, "No, I don't have to, you can't make me." Bit you at times and bit other people and snatched things out of people's hands. And folks, let's face it, these little people at age 2, they are little criminals. Oh, they're cute little criminals. They've got pudgy little cheeks, and they have a cute little smile, but they're little criminals. They lie, they steal, they snatch things out of people's hands, they hit, they bite, they defy authority. We'd put an adult like this in jail. Now Grandma knew it was time for her child's rehabilitation. She had to begin bringing the curtain down on this first phase of child rearing, beginning around the 24th month of her child's life. And she wasn't in any terribly big hurry. She knew that she had about a year to bring the curtain completely down. And so, around age 2, she began bringing the curtain down. She shifted out of the role that she had been in for the first 2 years, servant. And over a year's time, she altered her child's perception of her completely. And folks, it is still the child's perception of his mother that is at issue here. Up until age 2, this child has a completely dysfunctional, erroneous, counterproductive, and downright dangerous view of who his mother is. She is his servant, he thinks, for life. One of the first things that Grandma did to revise her child's perception of her, she toilet trained her child on time. It is emblematic of the fact that we no longer give women permission in our culture today to extract themselves from servanthood to their children. That we are actually telling women it is all right to let an intelligent human being soil and wet himself until he is 3, 4, or even 5 years old. You see, folks, the issue is not simply that the child is still wearing diapers. The issue is that as long as the child is wearing diapers, the mother in the child's eyes is his servant. Because you cannot be perceived as other than a servant if you are bent over your child 6 or 7 times a day, changing him, powdering him, wiping him, making him dry. And Grandma knew, you see, this, and she didn't know this explicitly. She didn't think like this. Her parenting was pretty much intuitive. It was commonsensical. What I have to do today, in front of the audiences to whom I speak, is I have to analyze Grandma, because we don't any longer as a culture really understand what she did and why she did it. She knew that for the first 2 years of her child's life, she was bent over her child, doing things for him. And that to alter her child's perception of herself, she had to stand upright. She had to throw her arms, shoulders back. She had to straighten out her spine. And she had to begin to look like an authority figure. And folks, this is what she did. Beginning around age 2. She began to straighten up, move out of service to her child, And by the time he was 3 years old, he looked at her with a completely new set of eyes. By the time he was 3, this was a woman who looked like this. She was a formidable authority figure in his life. Folks, we no longer give women permission in our culture to do this. We tell women that the best mother is the mother who serves in perpetuity. And the consequences of this are dire, ladies and gentlemen. They are dire. What we have on our hands in this generation of children are children who are not only more ill-behaved than any other group of children in the planet, but any other group of children in American culture ever. People who come to this country from other lands, to whom I speak, tell me consistently that children in their countries do not behave the way American children behave. I was speaking recently to a couple from India who told me, they had moved here very recently, who told me that they were actually concerned about letting their children play with American children because they feared the influence of American children on their own children's behavior. Let me ask you guys a question. How many of you can honestly say that your children are as well behaved, meaning as respectful, as willing to accept responsibility when assigned by an adult? How many of you can honestly say, yeah, John, my children are every bit as well behaved as I was as a child? I have any takers on that? This isn't unusual, folks. It is not unusual at all. I spoke in Traverse City, Michigan, just to let you know that Indianapolis is not the only place this is happening. Back in the fall, to 750 people asked that question, not one hand went up. Daphne, Alabama, a year and a half ago, 500 people in a Catholic church, not one hand went up. And let me tell you who you are. You do not represent a cross-section of parents in Indianapolis. You represent the cream of the crop. The most concerned, the most conscientious, the most responsible, the most effort-oriented group of parents in this city. There is only one type of parent who will give up a Sunday afternoon to come hear stuff like this, and that is a parent who wants to do what is best for their children. And I ask, as I have in many audiences around the country, is there anyone here who can say with absolute confidence, my children are as well behaved as I was as a child, and not one of you raises a hand? Not one of you. And this is consistent, folks, with what I hear not only from people in other countries, but also from grandma. I talk to men and women in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. These people consistently, so consistently that I have to believe that this is the way it was, consistently tell me that 50 years ago in America, the typical child had stopped throwing tantrums and had stopped openly defying parental authority by his or her 3rd birthday. Now, can you imagine? This sounds like some sort of parenting nirvana to the contemporary ear. Stop throwing tantrums by age 3? Yeah. I asked my mother recently, I said, Mom, how old do you think I was when I threw my last tantrum? She went to the family photograph albums, which are all sort of chronological, and she went to the first one and she started leafing through the pictures of me as a youngster. And she came to this one picture and she said, oh, I think you were about that old. She took the picture out, and the date on the back indicated that I was between 2.5 and 3 years of age. And my mother is reporting that I had thrown my last tantrum by this point in time. Not that I, wasn't upset from that point on at certain decisions that she made, and not that she couldn't tell that I was upset. But folks, the stomping of the feet, the screaming, the falling on the floor, the flailing of the arms, the wailing had stopped. in my life by the time I was 2 years, 9, 10 months of age. And I was not, according to the reports of these old-fashioned people all around the country, an unusual child in this respect. And also, in the typical American child, this had stopped by age 3. No, I won't. You can't make me. That's toddler stuff, folks. Historically, I want you to understand that tantrums and open defiance of parental authority is toddler behavior. Now, you know, children may have stopped this stuff by age 3, but they were still mischievous. Let me assure you. They still, when their parents' backs were turned, were inclined to do exactly what their parents had told them not to do. I call that the Adam and Eve syndrome, and that's children for time immemorial. But throwing their shoulders back and openly defying parental authority had stopped by age 3. And folks, I talked again to people in other cultures who tell me that today in India and Pakistan and Japan and so on and so forth, that this still stops by age 3. Italy, France, it still stops by age 3. The danger in America, folks, is that we are beginning to think that this sort of behavior in a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old is normal. I call it the frog in hot water phenomenon. You know, it is said, and I don't know if this is true, but the analogy works anyway. If you take a frog and you drop him in very hot water, he will leap right out. But if you put the frog in just lukewarm water, very comfortable water, and then you put this container on the stove and you turn the heat on, that the frog will not jump out of the water. The frog will allow himself to be cooked in this water because the heat is coming up so very slowly and gradually that he doesn't notice it for all intents and purposes. And I suggest that this is what's happened in America with the behavior of American children. That the behavior of American children has worsened so gradually but so slowly and inexorably over the last 40 years that we're like frogs in water that's getting increasingly hot, folks. We don't notice it. We're habituated to it. And it's just getting worse and worse. I talk to teachers all across America as well. I do about 50 presentations a year exclusively to audiences of teachers, and it is not unusual for teachers to come up to me and say, John, it's not just in the last 40 years, it's in the last 5 years. The behavior of children in the classroom has worsened considerably since 1995. And where does this end, folks? Where does it end? Well, I suggest it isn't going to end, that we're headed down the slippery slope to child-rearing anarchy in America, child anarchy in America, and that what we need to do as a culture is to get a grip on this. And we're going to get a grip on it, I suggest, by re-embracing the principles and precepts that guided Grandma's parenting. It wasn't perfect. There are people who say, I idealize Grandma. No, I don't. I fully recognize that she was human and therefore sinful and imperfect, and that everything she did, including her child-rearing, was imperfect. What I'm suggesting is we have no alternative. This experiment that we've embraced for the last 40 years has failed miserably. And we are not going to be able to make little minor adjustments to it and get it to work. Our only option, I suggest at this point, is to abandon this ridiculous experiment in making children feel wonderful about themselves and re-embrace the ideas that guided Grandma's child-rearing. Grandma was focused on her child's behavior. When her child, she was focused on his behavior. When he misbehaved, she punished him. All she was doing, folks, was she was acting as the thresher of her child's behavior. The thresher. She was moving through her child's life, threshing his behavior, separating the behavioral wheat from the behavioral chaff, just saying to herself, well, I'll keep this, but no, this is going to go, and this is going to stay, and this is going to go. And there was no area of gray between what Grandma would let remain and what Grandma was going to get rid of. There was no big area of gray, if any area of gray at all. Because Grandma knew that if there was an area of gray in her own mind, that an area of gray in terms of his own morality and ethics would develop in her child's mind. And so it was just black and white. It was right and wrong. There were no excuses. There were none. Do you remember your parents saying that to you? Always with a finger in the air, wagging it at you. There are no excuses. There'll be no ifs, ands, or buts. Why were there no excuses? Genesis chapter 3, folks, read it. It's right there. That's why there should be no excuses. Because if you give them the opportunity to explain themselves, they lie. God comes to Adam. Explain yourself. Does he tell the truth? Does he say, Father, forgive me, I got carried away. Listen, I accept full responsibility for the choice I made? No. No, he does what human nature inclines us to do. And that is, he passes the buck. He says, it wasn't me, man. It was that woman. You gave her to me. That's what it says. You gave her to me. Like in part it was God's fault. And haven't you heard your children say that? Haven't you? Well, if you wouldn't have let me do it, I wouldn't have misbehaved. This is children, folks. It's human nature. And God goes to the woman and says, all right, I'm going to give you a shot at this. And she does the same thing. She doesn't accept responsibility for the choice that she made. She wants to pass it off on peer pressure. It was the serpent, not me. Folks, this is a story of peer pressure, or at least using peer pressure as an excuse. This is a story of the first two human beings who decided to use drugs. This is a story of human nature and how we are inclined toward pleasure and hedonistic, instant gratification. This is human nature. This is the child. This is what we are dealing with. Not an incarnate being of holy light sent down from heaven to grace us with his presence. A person who has to be taught not to misbehave before we can teach him how to properly behave. Before we can teach him to properly behave, we have to stop the misbehavior that he is inclined to generate by virtue of his or her nature, what he brought into the world with him, which is savagery and little criminality. And Grandma stopped it by age 3 with a combination of powerful discipline and powerful love. Powerful in both respects. And folks, what we have done is we have allowed ourselves to shift the emphasis away from the child's behavior, specifically when he misbehaves, to trying to understand his feelings. You know, in 1955, just to give you a contrast here, in 1955, when I was in the 3rd grade, if I misbehaved in Mrs. Hoy's class, it is conceivable that I would have been punished by 4 separate people that day. Mrs. Hoy, my principal, Mr. Crone, my mother when I got home, my stepfather when he got home. And not one of these people would have sat me down and said words to this effect. Now, John, we'd really like to help you understand what this was all about, and to do so, we need for you to get back in touch with the feelings that you were having just before this incident occurred. No, folks, nobody wanted to know how I felt before I had done what I did. And I'd come home and my mother would be, she'd have already heard about it, of course, because there was almost instant communication between teacher and parent in those days. And I'd come through the back door and my mother would be standing there, her hands on her hips, looking at me. And I'd say, Mom, I know you've heard and I can understand. I can explain. And she'd say, there will be no ifs, ands, or buts about this, because my mother knew if you give a child the opportunity to explain, he is not going to tell the truth. He is going to pass the buck. He is going to come up with his own version of it was the woman, it was the serpent. Do you know, and this is something that teachers inform me of all across America, do you know that today there are actually parents in America, there may be some in this audience, and if there are, just if I'm not stepping on your foot hard enough, you need to reach over and stomp on your own foot, who have actually said, my child has never lied to me? Are any of you out there? Now, I say to parents who believe that, come on, take the wool off your eyes, open your eyes, and begin to see your children for who they are. You're believing in something about your children that is counterproductive to them and counterproductive to you and counterproductive to me as well. Another person heard me speak in Ohio recently and got up in front of the second audience of the afternoon to introduce me, and she said, in the course of the comments about the first talk, she said something very much along the lines of something I've already shared with you that came from another person. She said, and I remembered back during John's talk to my childhood, and I realized that it was true. As a child, I had to be taught not how to tell the truth. I had to be taught to stop lying. And folks, this is what it's all about. It's realizing that the first thing we have to do is we have to correct to the greatest degree possible this human nature that this child has brought into the world with him. Grandma understood, but now we want to appreciate the child's feelings, understand why he did it. And folks, I hope you understand that the moment you try to explain this child's behavior in your own mind or understand it, that what you are doing is constructing an excuse. That this is totally antithetical to Grandma's idea that there will be no excuses. There are no excuses. There are no ifs, ands, or buts. And what happened, by the way, when it became all about the child's feelings and appreciating and understanding them, is that a great gulf widened between the male and the female parent. Grandma and Grandpa, their points of view on their children were very similar. But typically in America, not always, there are exceptions to everything that I talk about from up here, and I hope you guys appreciate that. But typically in America, there's a great gulf between the male and the female point of view concerning children and child rearing that never existed before. Never did. You see, when it became all about feelings, I'm convinced, and I see evidence of this everywhere in America, testimony to its effect and existence, by the way, from women. That women began to think that there was only one gender qualified to carry out the new psychological, feeling-oriented job of raising children, and that was women. Why? Well, because women are more sensitive to other people's emotions than are men. It's true what they say about us. We're not in touch with other people's feelings. We're not in touch with our own. We have a feeling and we get over it. And a woman has a feeling and she gets down into it. And this is not a value judgment, folks. I think the world would be a boring, to say the least, place if everybody was one way or everybody was the other way. To translate from the French, long live the differences. But Grandma knew that Grandpa was insensitive. He was an emotional Neanderthal. She knew this. See, Folks, it's like this. All of us, male and female, we come into the world with 8 crayons in our emotional crayon boxes. Yeah, we come into the world with red, yellow, blue, green, orange, purple, black, and white. 8 crayons in our emotional crayon boxes. But by the time a woman is 30 years old, she's got 64 crayons in her emotional crayon box. She's got aubergine and magenta and taupe and 8 shades of yellow, and the 30-year-old man's still functioning with the original 8. Yeah, and several of the points have never been worn. Grandma knew this. It didn't enter into her thinking about her husband's participation in child rearing. Let me be very specific. She had no problem whatsoever with his discipline of their children. His discipline of their children. And most of us heard it from a woman who, generally speaking, was very calm, not on the edge of hysteria, a woman who could have handled the situation herself quite easily and quite effectively, mind you. A woman who simply decided, for whatever reasons that day, she was going to bring in the big guns. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? We're just going to wait until your father gets home. And the emotional Neanderthal would come lumbering in at 6:30. And she'd say, "Sick 'em, Bruno." Knowing that he was going to go in there and he was going, in his discipline, to make the children feel bad. Feel bad. Because when a child misbehaves, that's the only way you can stop the misbehavior. In fact, you can't stop the misbehavior. The child has to stop the misbehavior. And the child is not going to stop the misbehavior unless the misbehavior has emotional consequences which he doesn't want to experience again, period. Emotional consequences. He's not going to stop that misbehavior. The only person who can stop it, him. He is not going to stop it unless you make him feel bad about it. Grandma knew this. When she disciplined the children, she set out to make them feel bad. Let me tell you about today's woman. All too often, number one, she is trying to discipline her children without ever making them feel bad. Because we have assigned to today's woman the job of psychological protectress for life. She is trying to discipline her children without ever making them feel bad. And when she does slip and she makes them feel bad, then she feels bad. Now, isn't that absurd? The child misbehaves. The mother ends up feeling bad. Folks, parenting in America is upside down, inside out, and backwards. It's crazy. This is insane. Absolutely insane. There's no other way to put it. And today's woman, unlike Grandma, this number 2, she is often found running disciplinary interference between her children and her husband. Basically doing this. No, no, no. I'll handle this. You didn't read the book. And he didn't. Because the book is all about the child's feelings and how you have to appreciate them and understand them and cater to them and make excuses. And the guy is looking at this going, this is rubbish. Because, see, the male mentality toward parenting is still, generally speaking, with exceptions, stuck back there in the 1950s. It's stuck back there. We just don't get all this modern, feeling-oriented stuff. And women know this. And it scares them. And so, many women refuse to allow their husbands to discipline their, in the singular sense, children. Today's women believe The child rearing project rests almost completely on their shoulders. On their shoulders. They're the only gender qualified to carry it out properly. Their husbands just don't get it and never will. They've tried to get them to read the books and they won't. Or if they do, they go, honey, this is trash, okay? Unmitigated trash. Why do you read this stuff? And then why do you complain to me because the children's behavior is so bad? And then why do you not let me discipline the kids? But you want me to read these books. The same books that are causing you to have the problems that you keep complaining about to me concerning the children. Do you know, folks, let's roll time backwards. Do you know, well, I'll just do it. Grandma was pretty relaxed in her parenting, and she was dealing with the same human nature that today we're dealing with, but she had a realistic vision concerning this human nature. Now, let me show you how relaxed Grandma was, because she understood the realities of her child and understood, therefore, the realities of her responsibilities. She was not deluded by psychobabble one bit, hampered and encumbered by it. How many of you were raised by women you obeyed? In other words, your mothers. Women you obeyed who never yelled. Raise your hands. Now, by that I mean, your mothers may have raised their voices to emphasize a point, but never did their voices go shrieking through the sound barrier, How many of you obeyed your mothers? They never yelled. Let's see those hands up. And I want you to keep them up because I want people in the front to turn around and look at how many hands are up, okay? Now, folks, we're talking about a group of people here who represent the way children were raised in America 40 years ago. And look how many of you can say, yeah, my mother, she might have raised her voice, but she never shrieked and yelled. She never lost it. Is there a woman in this audience today with children living with her in the home who can say her children obey her as well as she did her mother and she has never yelled? I've got 1, 2. I've got 3. Well, sometimes I get none. I got a woman in Hartford, Connecticut, after 3 weeks of getting no hands up to this at all, see? A woman in Hartford, Connecticut, sitting right where these young ladies are right here, raised her hand, looking very, excited. And I looked at her because I hadn't gotten a hand up in 3 weeks, and she said, well, he's only 5 months old. Now, folks, I would venture to guess that 50% of you raised your hand to the first question and 3 of you raised your hand to the second. Now, what does this tell you? It tells you that parenting has become extremely stressful for the American female. Extremely stressful for the American female. And let me tell you what is stressful for the American male. It is stressful to stand and have to watch this stuff and being held at arm's length and being told, no, 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 I'll handle it. Aren't any women clapping, are there? Some of you women are out there going, I wish I hadn't brought my husband today. Some of you guys are out there going, I didn't want to come, but I'm glad I'm here. And folks, I want you to understand, there are actually people who listen to this talk and have accused me of sexism. Excuse me? No. If you're doing that, then you don't want to accept the message. This isn't about women. This is about what's happened to women. This is the most paradoxical generation of women to ever inhabit our culture. This is a generation of women who've taken admirable, huge strides forward professionally, politically, economically, educationally, and have indentured themselves to their children in perpetuity. And folks, this is a major problem in the American family. In the American family, this gulf between the male and the female has resulted in, or been caused by the fact, however you look at it, in the American mother viewing herself, regardless of whether she's married or not, as a single parent. In her own mind, she sees herself as a single parent. She is singularly responsible for the outcome of this project, singularly responsible for the success of her children in life, singularly responsible for their behavior, singularly responsible for their grades in school, singularly responsible for what college they get into, etc., etc., etc. Today's mother thinks, to put it in the vernacular, it's all about her. And this is the straitjacket we have fashioned for this generation of American women. And they have just slipped right into it and allowed themselves to be tied up in it. And it's tearing women apart, as indicated by the fact that hardly any of you can say, your children obey you as well as you obeyed your mother and you've never yelled. It's tearing our culture apart, as evidenced by the fact that none of you can say that your children are as well behaved as you were when you were children. It's tearing us apart at the seams. That we no longer give American women permission to straighten up where their children are concerned and put their hands on their hips and look at their children and say things like this, you see, because this is what this woman said. And this is what today's women don't feel they have permission to say. Things like this. I don't have time for you right now. Now, I want you to go away and leave me alone. Folks, this is how, by the way, you women, I'm speaking directly to you, this is how you stop yelling. This is how you stop yelling. You give yourself complete permission to say these things right up front. You had better leave me alone or you will be sorry that you didn't. Because if you can't find something to do right now, I am going to find something for you to do. What is it going to be? This is how you stop yelling. You stop yelling by understanding what Grandma meant by you're going to fight your own battles, paddle your own canoe. You're going to lie in the beds you make. This is how you stop yelling. But today's woman, you see, she is fettered by the messages that are written on what I call the mother bar. The mother bar. The mother bar is the bar that today's mothers think they have to clear on a daily basis. And these messages read, and these messages were not imposed on women of previous generations. These messages read, the best mother is the busiest mother, the mother who spends the most quality time with her children, the mother who provides the most in terms of after-school activities, who helps them the best with their homework, who does the most for them, who drives them around all the time, who arranges their social calendar, who fixes it every time they get upset. Let's just talk about the last one. My mother, being a representative mother of the last grandma generation, she didn't think she had to fix it when I got upset. She thought I had to fix it. If a teacher upset me, but listen folks, if a teacher upset me, I didn't even tell my mother. And I hoped the teacher wouldn't tell my mother. Because the only reason in my mother's mind that a teacher would have upset me is because I was doing something meriting being upset. And I knew that if my mother found out that the teacher had upset me, my mother would upset me even more. And I didn't come home and go, she doesn't like me. But today's women, it's amazing. Today's women, they hear that from a child, from a 6, 7, 8-year-old child, whom, says Proverbs 22:15, it may be in front of you, has foolishness bound in his heart. We take the word of a child as credible. A child comes home and says, my teacher doesn't like me, and the mother rises up indignantly and marches to the school and tries to straighten this out. This is absurd. Today's mother thinks if the playmates upset her child, she's got to get out there and fix it. Listen, if I came home and said, this is just the contrast, if I came home and said, they're not playing fair, my mother would have just simply taken me by the hand and said, then you don't need to be outside for the rest of the day. Come on in here. I've got a lot of things that you can do in here for me, beginning with washing the kitchen floor. Come on, you're going to wash the kitchen floor. And folks, that was the last time I came home and said that kids were not playing fair. And you know something? I'm speaking to you women. You can become this kind of mother anytime you want. Anytime you want. See, the purpose of me being up here today is to show you exactly what the contrast is. So that you know, from this point on, you have a choice. You have a choice. You can go home today, and I'm speaking to every single one of you women. You can go home today, and you can walk in the door of your house, and it'll be like you molted that other mother. Okay? Just like that. Okay? Today's mother feels when she upsets her child, she's got to fix it. My mother never thought when she upset me that she had to fix it. When she upset me with a decision that she made, her term was, I'm just going to let you, what? Exactly, stew in your own juices. I'm just going to let you stew in your own juices about this. My mother thought if she made a decision that upset me, my distress was indication she had made the right decision. Today's mother thinks if she makes a decision that makes the child feel bad, the child's distress is indication she's made a bad decision. What? Excuse me? Again, thinking children know what's best for themselves? But see, it's in terms of psychic pain. We mustn't cause any psychic pain on our children. And because today's mother is this flurry of doing things for her children, whereas grandma, see, as time went on from age 2 on, she tried to do less and less for her children. In fact, and this may sound incredibly cold and callous to the modern ear, but grandma, by the time her child was 3 and a half or 4, her goal on a daily basis was to do as little for and have as little to do with her children as possible. Now, doesn't that sound cold and callous to the modern ear? But that was it. It was all in the service of helping them stand on their own 2 feet. It was all in the service of getting them to accept responsibility for their own behavior. And most of you were raised, ladies and gentlemen, because those of you who were raised by women you obeyed who never yelled, I guarantee you, the same people who raised their hands to that question were raised by a woman who, by the time you were 4 years old, was trying to have as little to do with you as she possibly could on a daily basis. And today's mother, as time goes on, is trying to find more and more for herself to do. Grandma's effort curve went like this, and today's mother's effort curve is going like this. She's a flurry of activity, doing things for her children constantly, their homework and checking this and checking that and arranging their social calendar, driving them to one activity after another to strengthen the various brain modules she read about in Newsweek magazine, and she's got to get them into Suzuki violin by age 4 and all these things before, the music module shuts down and so on and so on and so forth, and it's all up to her. And the modern American dad, he's what I call the parenting aide. The parenting aide. He stands off to the side if he's interested, and every man here today is interested. He stands off to the side watching this flurry of activity. He's there like a teacher's aide. He's there to take instruction from the real parent, which he is not. And he's there to fill in for the real parent when the real parent needs a break. And he's standing there watching, this woman do this and this and this. And every once in a while she turns and goes, "Are you just going to stand there?" Well, folks, he's learned that if he does something, his wife's going to tell him he did it. Exactly. So he takes the safe avenue and simply waits for instruction, okay? He's not going to take any initiative. Every time he does, he gets his hand slapped, Oh, and this runs deep. I was at, it's comedy. If you look at parents through the eyes that I've developed over the last 22 years of writing my newspaper column, it's comedy, And you guys can develop these eyes very quickly. I'm at Charlotte Douglas Airport about a year or so ago. I'm checking in curbside, and I know all the curbside guys by name, and so I just walk up and, "Hey, man," and put my bags down and put my ticket on top of my bags, and they take it from there, And I stand back usually, and I just engage in my favorite sport, which is watching people. And not because I'm a psychologist, because I'm nosy and a voyeur. And a hotel van pulls up, and out step a mother, a father, and a little 4-year-old boy, and the mother says to the father, "I'll check us in. You help him on with his book bag." Simple enough assignment. She walks over to the counter and she begins talking to the baggage agent, and I notice that as she's talking to the baggage agent, she keeps looking back. She's probably telling the baggage agent how many bags they have and where they're going, and etc. Excuse me just a moment. She walks back over to where her husband is with her child, and she says, No, that's not how you pack the book bag. You're putting hard things in the front. If you put hard things up against his back, it'll chafe his little shoulder blades as he walks along. You have to put soft things in the front and the harder thing. I'll do it. And she begins rearranging all the things in the backpack, you know? And the husband just he steps up and moves over to the side like this, and now he's standing right next to me, okay? And, he's gotten up very close, and he looks at me, and he doesn't know me from Adam, I'm sure, but he looks at me, and I'm just kind of standing there looking at him, smiling, because I've seen this whole thing, I've seen every mother, She can't even let him pack the book bag. He does it wrong. He'll chafe his little shoulder blades. He might have to go into therapy when he's 25 years old and recover the memory of walking through Charlotte Douglas Airport in 1998 feeling this terrible pain in his shoulder blades. And why would my mother have allowed my father to do this, doctor? And I'm just standing there smiling, and he knows I've seen the whole thing. And he looks at me and he goes, as if, what can I do, I'm totally incompetent and I ought to accept it. And every once in a while the mother, she's doing and fixing and doing and driving and providing and anticipating and doing and fixing, and every once in a while she'll get really tired. I can't keep this up. I just can't keep this up. You'll have to step in for me for a while. Come on. But I'll be watching you. Because, and you women know this, he needs supervision, doesn't he? You just can't let him do it on his own. He might blow the whole thing. It'd be awful, terrible. You'd come back after 2 hours and the psychological apple cart is spilled over and all the apples you've been carefully arranging for the last few years are spread all over the floor, and you go, "What's been going on here?" And he goes, "We've been having fun," Oh, mercy. Okay, it's an absurd image, but here's the fact of the matter is that because American women have accepted all of these messages written on the mother bar, you know something? The typical American woman is not married to her husband, she's married to her kids. Now that's an uncomfortable thought, and I hate to throw it out there, but if you guys are going to go home and change all this, I've got to make you somewhat uncomfortable about what's going on in your family today. There's just no doubt about it. In the overwhelming majority of American households, the mother is married to her children. Most of you grew up in households where the relationship that occupied center stage, and it was not a perfect relationship in any household, because, a little tangent here, human beings are imperfect. Everything we do is imperfect. Our marriages are imperfect, our families, our child rearing, everything. But for all of its imperfections, the relationship between your mother and father stood center stage. I'm describing the household most of you grew up in. And the household that most children in America today are growing up in is a household in which the relationship that stands center stage is the mother-child relationship. And folks, the mother within this relationship is a perpetual servant. And let me just put it very, very bluntly. You do not respect the servants. And you women, Your children are talking to you in ways that Grandma would have found, first of all, intolerable. The first time one of her children talked to her the way your children, some of you, talk to you on a daily basis, Grandma would have nipped it right in the bud. It wouldn't have happened a second day. All across America, because you don't respect the servants, there is an epidemic of children hitting their mothers in America. I'm not talking about toddlers. You see, this stuff historically is toddler behavior. Toddlers hit. Grandma cured toddlerhood, folks. She cured it. By the time her child was 3, he wasn't a toddler any longer. There's an epidemic of children in America, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, who, when their mothers do not perform to their satisfaction, they haul off and they hit their mothers or kick them or spit on them, all the while talking to them like they're dirt. You don't respect the servants. And it cannot be said that under these circumstances, children are learning respect for women. It can't be said. And this is dangerous, folks. It's dangerous. Today's women have not taken strides forward. They've taken strides back. I grew up with respect for women. By the time I came to school, I knew when a woman said, do it, you did it. And today's children, when do they learn this? When do they learn that women mean business? When do they learn that women are the embodiment of parent power? When do they learn this? 50 years ago, by the time I was 3, I was afraid of my mother. She'd never yelled, never spanked. She never did. I was afraid of her. Because in a child's mind, this formidable authority figure who's standing and looking at you like this every once in a while, immovable, is an intimidating figure. And to a child, intimidation is translated right into fear. I had no reason to fear my mother, but I did because she presented herself to me as this formidable, indomitable human being who meant exactly what she said. And any one of you women can go home and be that woman today. It's a choice. Today's mother is afraid of her child in perpetuity. By the time I was 4, I was working for my mother. Today's mother works for her child in perpetuity. She never stops being a servant. Never does. Okay, that's the first half of a 2-part presentation. I hope that most of you are coming back for the second half, because in the second half, I'm going to get very, very specific about exactly how to correct this problem that we have created for ourselves by listening to the wrong people, people like me. But come on back and hear some more from people like me. Thank you, folks. Thank you. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.